Okay, today we are going to talk about one of our guiding questions, one of the things that is going to help us understand and explain what is happening as we take the matter from food and convert it into matter in our bodies. So, the first question that we're going to try to answer today is just what is the food we eat actually made up of? And to understand that, we have to talk about carbon, okay? So when we think about carbon, carbon is actually what we call the foundation of life, okay? Pretty much everything in your body and all of the molecules in living things are going to be made up of a carbon backbone or a carbon skeleton, okay? So a backbone or a skeleton, which basically just means that we have a whole bunch of carbon atoms that are going to be bonded to one another. When we talk about these molecules that are made up of carbon and that make up the parts of living things, we call these molecules organic molecules. Okay, so these are going to be any molecule that are made up of a series of carbon atoms that are bonded to one another. So carbon atoms that are specifically covalently bonded to each other. All right. And then to other nonmetals like hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, those things are going to be our organic molecules. So we've talked a few times about chunks, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. Your food is primarily made up of molecules that are made up of carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms, nitrogen atoms, and so on. Okay, so what makes carbon so special and what allows carbon to be the backbone of so many different molecules? Well, it's going to start with one feature of carbon that we've actually already talked about. Carbon has four valence electrons. Okay, so remember that those valence electrons are going to be the electrons in that outer orbital or the ones that are involved in bonding. Carbon has one, two, three, four of them. Okay, now we know that atoms to become stable are trying to fill their valence shell. So for carbon to fill its valence shell, it has to be able to form four bonds. Those bonds can be with other carbons, with hydrogen, with oxygen, any of those molecules or atoms, sorry, that we talked about here. So can form four bonds. And again, those bonds are covalent bonds. Okay, so again, here's our diagram. We see the four electrons that belong to carbon, and we see that it is sharing those electrons with hydrogen, okay, to fill its valence shell. Remember that when we see a formula like this, that every line is going to represent two shared electrons, okay? So we can see here that carbon now has 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons in its valence shell, which makes it stable and happy, okay? All right, that four bonds, okay, it doesn't just have to be single bonds like we see here, although carbon can form single bonds, okay, but it can also form double bonds and triple bonds, okay? So if we look at our two carbons, all right, we can see that we can bond where we share just two electrons with a single bond. We can share four electrons here, like we see in this double bond, or we see here two carbons sharing actually six electrons with this triple bond. Okay, now what this does is it increases the variety of different structures that we can form with even just two carbon, right? So here we see two carbon, two carbon, two carbon, and we see that we have totally different structures, even though we only have those two carbon atoms as a result of those single, double, or triple bonds, okay? Now, another unique thing about carbon, because it has four valence electrons, because it can form four covalent bonds, because it forms double, single, triple bonds, okay, is that our carbon atoms, when they bond to each other, can form like linear or straight chains. They can form like a ring kind of structure, or they can even form branch chains. So here we see a few of those images, right? So here is an example where we see all the carbons in the backbone or the skeleton are in a single line. That's going to be your straight or linear chain. Okay, here we see we have a linear or a straight chain in that backbone bone or skeleton, but we also have this branch chain. Okay, this is our example of branch. All right, here we see that because carbon can form both those double bonds and single bonds, that it can form rings with that same carbon skeleton. Okay, so this is a huge variety of molecules that we can make just with carbon and hydrogen. Imagine the variety that we can make when we start bonding carbons to things like oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and hydrogen, right? So lots and lots of different structures we can make, all because of the properties of our carbon molecule, okay? So again, carbon can form literally millions upon millions of unique structures, and these are going to be the molecules or the structures that make up all living matter or all living things. These molecules that we're talking about made from the carbon skeleton are going to fall into four categories that we call macromolecules. Okay, so macro means large, okay, and then we obviously know that molecules are atoms bonded to each other covalently. So large covalently bonded molecules. These molecules fall into those four categories. The first category is going to be our carbohydrates, okay, or sometimes people call them carbs. The next category is going to be lipids, which you might call fats, right? The next category is going to be your proteins. And then the last category is your nucleic acid. So that's like your DNA and your RNA. So all of these things are what we call macromolecules. And we actually have a second name for these. That second name that pretty much means the same thing is going to be polymers. Okay, so polymers are going to be really large molecules, right? Just like we said for the macromolecules, but they're large molecules that are made up of repeating building blocks. And those building blocks, so repeating building blocks, those building blocks are actually going to be called monomers. Okay, so all of our macromolecules are examples of polymers. Poly means many, and that just means they're made up of many building blocks that we call monomers. Okay, so how do we build up and break down these macromolecules, these polymers? Okay, we have actually two different biochemical reactions that we're going to use to either build these molecules or to break them down. One of these is called dehydration synthesis, first super important chemical reaction you need to know. And the second one is called hydrolysis. Second, super important reaction you need to know. Okay, so we're going to start with dehydration synthesis. So you've probably heard this word dehydration before, okay? Dehydration, we know, means that we don't have enough water, right? It is a removal of water. Synthesis is going to mean that we're going to make something. So every time you see that word synthesis, you should be thinking, oh, we are making something here. And this is a biochemical reaction in which our covalent bonds are formed, okay, through the loss or removal of a molecule of water, okay? So I'm going to say an H2O molecule. So we are building covalent bonds by removing a water molecule. Dehydration, removing water, synthesis to make, okay? So I like to remember, if I remember one thing, or if you remember one thing about dehydration synthesis, you want to remember it's a building reaction, okay? So to synthesize, to make, to build. It is taking the monomers, okay, or the building blocks, and using those monomers, covalently linking them together to form polymers. Okay, so remember, polymers are the same thing as our macromolecules, those really large molecules made up of repeating building blocks or monomers. Okay, so how does this work? Right here, we have a short polymer. It's a polymer because it's made of 1, 2, 3 building blocks, okay? And over here, we have our fourth building block, which is just an unlinked monomer. So monomer 1, monomer 2, monomer 3, all bonded to form a polymer. And then we have this unlinked monomer all by itself, okay? So what we see is on one end, we have a hydrogen, okay? So on monomer 3, we have a hydrogen. And on monomer 4, we have an OH group, or remember, that's our hydroxyl group. So what we're going to do here is we are going to break off the hydrogen and that hydroxyl group, okay? And we are going to put those together to form a water. So here, that's that dehydration part, the removal of the water, okay? When we remove that water, these two monomers, monomer 3 and monomer 4, are going to be able to bond with each other. Kind of think about it like they're puzzle pieces that we can't connect until we remove the water. This right here is where we form that one covalent bond, okay? So what's our end result here? Our end result is that we end up with a long polymer, okay, made up of those repeating monomers. And we're going to end up with one water for each bond made. Okay, so one water for each one bond made. So when we made this first bond here, we removed a water. Second bond here, removed a water. Third bond, removed a water. Okay, so right here we have linked together 4 monomers to form a polymer. And in that process, we made 1, 2, 3 bonds. So we removed 1, 2, 3 waters. Okay, so every time you make a bond, you need to remove a water. Okay, so that's our building reaction. That's how we make the big molecules. Well, how do we break them down? Okay, we're going to break them down through our second biochemical reaction. And that second reaction is hydrolysis. Okay, hydro means water. And lysis is going to be a root word that we see in biology that means to break. Okay, so if you break these words down into their root words, water and breaking. In this reaction, what we're going to see is that we are breaking covalent bonds, okay, through the addition of a water molecule. Okay, so we add the water to break the bond. We remove the water to make the bond, right? So here we like to think about this. If you remember one thing about hydrolysis, you want to remember it's a breaking reaction. Okay, so again, lysis means to break. You're going to see it again later in the year. So to break. So it's a breaking reaction. In this reaction, we are taking our polymer or our large macromolecule and we're breaking it back down into its monomers. Okay, so breaking down the polymer into its monomers. So if we look at this example here of the reaction, we can see it's pretty much the opposite of our dehydration synthesis reaction. Here we're starting with a long polymer made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 monomers, and we see that it has 1, 2, 3 covalent bonds. In order to break one of these bonds, like this bond right here, between monomer 3 and 4, what we're going to do is we're going to take a water molecule. That water molecule is going to split into a hydrogen and into that OH group. Okay, we call it a hydroxyl group. And in that way, through the addition of a water molecule, we break, oops, that's not how you spell break, we break a bond, okay? So the water is split, the hydrogen gets added to one monomer, the OH or hydroxyl group gets added to the other monomer, and the end result here is that our polymers are broken down into their individual monomers, okay? So polymers are broken down into their building blocks, their subunits, their monomers, okay? So I'm just going to say building blocks, or we can call those monomers, okay? And again, just like we said, for every bond that we're breaking, we need to add a water. So if we want to break this bond between monomer 2 and 3, we've got to add a water. If we want to break this bond, we've got to add a water. So if we're breaking 9 bonds, we're adding 9 waters, okay? So this is where we're going to stop for today. I know this was a lot of new vocabulary. We've got polymer, we've got monomer, right? Hydrolysis, dehydration synthesis, okay? Macromolecules and organic molecules, okay? So lots and lots of stuff for you to know. Hopefully you can think a little bit more about how this relates to the food that we eat and think about what you can add to your model. All right, I hope that this all made sense and you can reach out with any questions.